Hello, may I just interrupt? I have the pleasure of chairing this session, and my strict instructions are to ensure that we stick to time. So I'm going to invite Paul to give his paper, which is on Among the Animals, the human-animal distinction in Christian theological anthropology. So over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you for the Science and Theology Forum and Dr. Finlay Lawson for giving me this opportunity to speak. My name is Paul Gesting. I teach theology at Martin Bucer Seminary in Munich, Germany. I'm originally from the States. I also have an interest in the science and religion field. I spent about a little over 10 years working at NASA in Houston on human spaceflight. I did my first 2 degrees in aerospace engineering. So the interaction between science and religion has always been something interesting to me. I've been very blessed by your books, Professor Book. They've been very, very helpful to me, so thank you for that. My talk is going to be about the human-animal distinction in theological anthropology. So I'm going to do my intro and methodology first, and then we'll go through the other sections here in a moment. So first, my introduction and methodology. My guess is I'm probably a minority at this conference that who hold to a ontological human-animal distinction. I don't think this is terribly in vogue in the moment in discussions of science and religion, specifically science and Christian religion, where the desire is to push towards less of a distinction between humans and animals. But I'm going to argue in this paper that I think that the Bible does posit a distinction between humans and animals. There's a lot of literature on this topic, obviously, and I can't engage with all of it, so I just picked 3 modern thinkers and writers who engage in this topic to discuss with. So my methodology, since I am beginning from a Christian perspective, I'm going to limit this to Christian theological anthropology. So therefore my starting point is going to be within the Christian scriptures, using the Bible as my starting point. I don't talk too much in this topic, but I do believe that this should therefore be informed by historical theology. How have Christian thinkers thought about this? There's a lot on this, and unfortunately I can't get into it in this, but this is also a very interesting avenue. But I think that the direction is important. That historical theology should inform our Christian theology, but does not necessarily drive it. And that I think that therefore in discussions of science and Christian religion, that therefore this should be a starting point. So I'm not going to engage with the science on this. There's lots of much smarter people here in the room who can deal with this better than me, who are actual scientists. I'm an engineer, so I'm an applied scientist, we'll say. But my argument is that in order for faithful interaction between science and Christian religion in this to take place, that we must get the science right, but we also must get the theology right. And therefore, this is where I think the dialogue should start and engage in. And finally, ethics. I'm not going to get into this here. This is obviously a very important topic. There's been lots of people who have engaged in this. This is not the point of my topic. I would argue that this is before this. That in order to get the ethics right, I think we obviously need, from a Christian point of view, we obviously need to get the Christian theology correct as well. So I'm going to move into the biblical foundations. I'm going to spend a lot of time in Genesis. This is where most writers and thinkers engage with in this. And then some other biblical themes. I kind of just grouped a lot of themes together from the rest of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Unfortunately, like I said, I have to move a little fast, or let's say not go into great detail in a lot of areas because of the length of the talk. So obviously, beginning in Genesis in day 6, the humans and the land animals are created on the same day. And the humans are created in the image of God, we learn in Genesis 1:26 through 28. And these 2 verses here form much of the basis for the Christian understanding for the image of God. And these come from the phrase, in our image according to our likeness, we'll say. There are 2 nouns here, demut and tselem, and 2 prepositions, the preposition beit and the preposition kaf. And there's been a lot of discussion on this, and modern theologians within the past, let's say, 100 years have similarly argued that these mean roughly the same thing, and they're therefore overlapping. I'm going to argue that these are not interchangeable, and that I'm going to talk to it a little bit briefly, but much of this research comes from the great monographs by Randall Garr and Catherine McDowell. They have done great work in this area, interacting with these words in the ancient Near Eastern literature. Catherine McDowell specifically in the Egyptian rituals of opening the mouths of the idols in Egyptian ceremonies. That's very, very helpful. The Old Testament scholar Peter Gentry also discusses this. But my argument is, following Randall Garr and Catherine McDowell, that these two words are not interchangeable. They mean similar things, but they mean specific things. So, starting with bait, so in our image, bait plus tselem, the bait idea is co-referential. It's correspondence. The main idea of this is locative, like existing in the same location. Tselem is the word used for image, is used all throughout ancient Near Eastern literature, mainly for the manifestation of a deity. So it is used obviously in the Old Testament for do not worship idols. This word is tselem here. But interesting enough, here in Genesis 1, it is used in a positive context, not in a negative context like the rest of the Bible. And here it is not the idol that images the divine, that is a manifestation of the deity, but it is all humans. And in the ancient Near Eastern context, the tselem, the idol, has the authority to bring about the rule of the deity. And I think this is, Catherine McDowell has showed this is behind some of the ideas that are in Moses', or the author of Genesis' mind, we'll say, when he is writing this. In our likeness, this is the preposition kaf with demut. The preposition kaf has the idea of similarity between two dissimilar things. So whereas bait showed great similarity, kaf here is showing a dissimilarity. So dissimilarity between humans and God. Demut has much less, it exists much less in the ancient Near Eastern literature of the time. It is only used 25 times in the Old Testament, usually for theophanies, so the visual manifestations of God. It is used a lot in the human genealogies in Genesis and in the Old Testament in the sense of procreation, so that the humans are making other humans according to their likeness. And this is where I think it is important, is that this is showing how humans are like God and that they can make more image bearers. We see this in Genesis 5:3 when Adam makes a son in his image and his likeness, where the prepositions are actually reversed. And this is because humans make new image bearers different than God made first image bearers. He created them out of nothing. Humans here procreate. This requires both male and female, showing that both men and women are equally in the image of God. So I think here that what is showing here, both the prepositions and these nouns, is that humanity is being shown to be very much like God in his image, but also distinct, very different from God. There's the creator-creature distinction, and yet there is some likeness. There's a double comparison here, being very much like God, yet being very distinct from God. These two nouns show two things. They show a kingly reign in tselem, as well as kinship. So demut is often having to do with procreation, so being sons and daughters. So here it is showing that humans are to, in some way, be servant kings, we'll say, whereas at the same time being sons and daughters of God. But they are completely different from God. They are not the same thing. There is a creator-creature distinction. The result of this, we find in Genesis 1:28 and following, is that humans are given dominion and rule. Now, this is very important. This is not a part of the image. It is not that humans have dominion and rule and therefore in the image of God. It is not that humans are created in order to have dominion and rule, but that humans are created as sons and daughters of the living God with, in a way that they are to image God to creation, to stand in his place, to represent him. And therefore, the result of this is that God gives them dominion and rule. And as we just saw in the previous lecture that I was in, this has to do with the naming of the animals, right? That God brings the animals to man to see what he would name them. Dominion by itself is not inherently sinful. God has ultimate dominion over all that is created. And he does not do this in a sinful way. God in Genesis 1 and in Genesis 1, in the first 4 days, he names things. He names day and night. He names the sea and the land. But here he delegates the naming of the animals to man to see what man would name them, showing that he has given them vice-regency over creation. So this is a very short introduction to how I think in our image and according to our likeness has to do with the way humans were created with a specific purpose in a specific way. Another thing that often shows up in the literature is the breath of life. We get this from Genesis 2:7. And there are all throughout the literature in Christian theological anthropology arguing that both humans and animals have the breath of life. And I'm going to argue that I think we need more clarity and distinction here with this. And this is because in Genesis 2:7, we see the Hebrew term neshama, so neshama hayim, which is the breath of life here. This word occurs only 24 times in the entire Hebrew Old Testament, meaning both concrete physical breath, as well as having a metaphorical usage, meaning breath that sustains life, or a living, something like this, like having to do with when this is removed that you die. There are many instances of this referring directly back to Genesis 2:7. And many of these instances have to do with judgment. So it says that God will destroy all who have breath in them because of their sin. We see this in Joshua and Deuteronomy and things like this. It shows up in the Psalms a couple times. And that's showing that Yahweh is the owner of this, that Yahweh is the one who is able to judge and for this to punish sin. And what is other interesting is that this word is never used with an animal as a referent. It is often used explicitly as a man, or sorry, as a human. We'll say it uses Adam, which we translate man, but it just means human. And other times it is by the context that we see that it is speaking of humans. It says the nations or these people groups that have this breath in them. I'm going to skip. I had a section here on some what we would say might be ambiguous reference in these four passages. I think that the context is clear in these, but I'm going to skip through them. If you have questions on these, we can, of course, discuss this at the end, but I'm going to try to move along. There are other forms of the breath of life in the Bible. This is where I think the confusion happens. There are other words used, so specifically with ruach, which has a very wide semantic domain. It can mean anything from spirit, so God's spirit, human spirit. It can mean wind. It can mean breath. So it's interesting in Ezekiel, ruach is the only word in this entire semantic domain that is used in the entire book of Ezekiel. And in Ezekiel 34 through 36, it's used in four different ways, right? It means God's spirit, it means human spirit, it means the winds that are blown from the four corners, it means breath that comes into humans. So very, very, very wide semantic domain. And in Genesis 2:7, this says there is ruach hayim, which is breath of life, which specifically refers to both humans and animals. And so this has a very wide semantic domain, and I think here we're starting to see this both distinction and similarity, right? So we see that both humans and animals have physical breath, ruach, that supports life. But the author, just a few chapters after using neshama hayim for humans only, is making a distinction here, and I think that this is important. In fact, in Genesis 6:7, it says that where typically English translate that they will perish, in the Hebrew it says they will gasp for breath. So it says everyone who has ruach hayim, breath of life in them, or living breath, will gasp for breath in the flood. And so it's showing here that humans and animals are both going to perish in the flood. Similarly, that they both require breath to sustain life. We see this again in Genesis 7, here, where breath of life is only used for the animals, ruach hayim. And so this is interesting, where the author is clearly free to go back and forth between speaking of using neshama only for humans, then using ruach for both humans and animals, then using ruach only for animals. So the author here is very fluid in what he is using, but he's clear in the words that he uses. So some words have a wider semantic domain than others. And when he wants to make a distinction, he's very clear in what he is doing. Again, while both humans and animals require physical breath to live, they will gasp for breath, he's also making a distinction because just a few verses later, he will speak of humans dying in the flood, again using the same word from Genesis 2:7, which is a different word, neshama. And so he's clearly here drawing the conclusion that they are similar, but also at the same time that they are distinct. We see this again in Job. I'll just go through this one very briefly, but the argument is that the author is choosing words carefully depending upon their semantic range and how he uses them in context. Another common argument has to do with the fact that both humans and animals are living beings, nefesh haya in the Hebrew. This is 100% true. Animals and humans are both described as living beings. And we don't want to diminish this. This is showing the similarity in the first day of creation between humans and animals. The animals are called living beings in Genesis 1:30 and humans in Genesis 2:7. It's showing, linking them both to being created by God, to being physical creatures that need breath to live. But we also don't want to therefore conclude from this that means that there are no distinctions between humans and animals, because what is interesting is that this is the only place that humans are called nefesh hayah. Nefesh hayah is actually a word used for animals, living being in the Old Testament, and this is the only place that humans are called this. And I think it's to tie the humans to the animals in creation, and it's to show their closeness to the animals. But there's also, I think, a distinction here, and that in Genesis 1, on day 6, the animals are brought forth from the ground and are made living beings. Whereas in Genesis 2:7, just a few verses later, humans are brought forth from the ground, but are not yet human beings until they have the breath of life, neshama hayim. Now we can discuss what that is. I'm not going to get into that, but I think the author here is showing that there is some distinction here. In fact, nephesh is used all through the Old Testament. It's used about 740 times in the Old Testament, a little over 207 times in the Torah, and it also has a wide range of reference. It's used twice for Yahweh. It's used in Leviticus 26, where he says, if you abhor Yahweh, Yahweh will abhor you. And he basically uses nephesh here for the desire. If the desire of your heart is to abhor Yahweh, Yahweh will therefore abhor you. And it's, again, tied to morality, as we have seen. Nephesh is also used for humans all through the Torah. It is used after the flood story. It's used almost exclusively for humans in the rest of the Torah. The two exceptions for this are in Leviticus 17, which we will cover, and then in Numbers 31. But the broad usage of this has to do with, it has both concrete usage, so like a specific person, like the number of people, like in Numbers when they're counting people, as well as a metaphorical usage for a living being, life. Nephesh is also used for animals. It's used a lot in Genesis 1 through 9, like we've seen, nefesh hayah. And then again, it is used in Leviticus 17, which I think is a very important one. This is the Day of Atonement, and it is tying the life of the animal who is substituting for the life of the sacrificer. And this is also in Genesis 9 where it says the life is in the blood. This is the same way that it's presented in Leviticus 17, and that the substitutionary life of the animal is substituted for the person offering it there. And I think this is very important in that it is showing the similarity here between humans and animals, but also the distinction of substituting one for the other. And of course, we see this again in Hebrews 9 and 10 in the New Testament. Another thing, nephesh, again, has a wide semantic range, like we've seen, that it can mean something metaphorical, like life, but it can also be concretely to mean a person. And so many times nephesh is just simply equated with soul in the theological anthropology. I think we need a little bit more clarity for this. This is not true in every instance. It does not mean soul. The Hebrew conception of the self, there's lots of good, Wolf's monograph on this, although it is old, is very, very good. The Hebrew conception of the self is very, it is not as separating, soul versus life versus body as perhaps the Greek thought did. The Hebrew conception of the self is very unified, that it is the entire person that is the self. Soul, body, mind, everything together. They did not separate this as different parts of the person. So it doesn't always just mean soul. The Hebrew mind didn't really conceive of things in this way. And so I think the more nuance and clarity is needed in discussing these things. And then another common theme, as I'll show in discussing with some later thinkers, has to do with all flesh.
Well, I have to alert
Yes, 5 more minutes?
Certainly fine.
Okay, 5 more minutes. Okay, so I'm gonna skip through this because we're gonna touch on this a little bit later. I'm gonna skip through that as well. So, some themes that we see in the rest of the Bible: animal suffering for sin of humans. We see this clearly in the prophets, clearly in the flood. The humans reject Yahweh. The animals under them suffer. This is in Joel, Hosea, everywhere. I'm going to skip through this as well. Okay, I'm going to try to go through the conclusion. So I think we see similarity. Humans and animals are both living beings and creatures. And we see distinction, that humans image God in a way separate. I'm going to discuss a little bit about some contemporary theological anthropologists. So beginning with Joshua Moritz, he has written a lot on this. He does a very good job of trying to work through the biblical text and that the image of God is limited to humans. But where I would disagree with him perhaps has to do with that he's going to argue two things. One, that animals are morally culpable, and that therefore Christ came as flesh as the sarx of all creatures. And I think I would push back a little bit on this, in that animals in the Old Testament, we see this especially in Exodus 21, are not punished in the same way that humans are punished. So animals are punished independent of intent. So we see this in Exodus 21 with a goring ox, that the ox it gets the same punishment whether it is the first time and they don't know if it is something habitual or not. But the owner is punished separately. So if it's the first time, the owner is not punished. But if it's known that the ox gored, then the owner is treated as a murderer, and the owner is punished as a murderer. And in the New Testament, sarx here is clearly tied to Christ's humanity, and that he took on human flesh in a way that is different. In fact, Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15 that not all sarx is, not all flesh is the same. I'll do a little bit about David Clough, where some points of disagreement maybe that I would push back against. Not dealing with ethics in this. This is purely just dealing with Christian theological anthropology. Professor Clough wants to remove any distinction, and that argues that we cannot look in Genesis 1 for the distinction, that it must only come from the New Testament. I'm going to push back on that and say I think we can learn some about what it means to be in the image of God, specifically from Genesis 1 and 2, and that tying this to the New Testament I think is important, because the New Testament teaches that Christ's imaging of the Father within the deity is the prototype by which he is able to assume in the hypostatic union a humanity which also images God. So I think these two things are tied together. I think we need more clarity when using language like animals image God. I think that when this is something that is we can't just blanket a statement that when the Bible speaks metaphorically of God acting in animal ways, that this is different than what he speaks about humans imaging God. I agree with Professor Clough that God's judgment falls on both humans and animals alike. However, I would push back a little bit on the language of the need of redemption. So I think there's a difference in using the words redemption and reconciliation, that all of creation will be reconciled to God by dealing with human sin. But redemption is something, I think, clearly tied to Christ's atoning work for sin. And so therefore, I would say we need a little bit more clarity in our language usage between whether or not all of creation needs to be redeemed. Daniel was talking about this yesterday, or whether it needs to be reconciled. And I think those are two different things, specifically in Romans 8 and Colossians 1. Professor Lindsay, as well, is mainly concerned with animal ethics. So like I said, I'm not going to touch with this. And I would disagree by saying that any distinction is self-serving. So he would argue that that we're only going to do a distinction for self-serving reasons. And I would say we are able to let the Bible teach that, or to say that there is a distinction without being domineering about it or saying I'm doing this for my own purpose. I think it is possible to have a theology that holds to a distinction and also has an animal ethic that cares for animals and animal creation. I reject the notion that we cannot have both. And again, I think Moritz follows Lindsay, will say in this, that Christ came as creature and that Christ suffered for creaturely suffering. I think we need a little bit more clarity here by saying what, between redemption, again, and atonement for sin, and reconciliation, which includes the effects of sin, like we saw all through the prophets. Animals suffer for human sin, and that this is, in the effects of Christ's work in dealing with human sin, includes the removal of animal suffering. I'm going to skip the part on the historic retrieval and say, okay, a way forward. I think, like I said before, we need to be faithful to science. Again, not the point of my talk. But we also need to be faithful to Christian theology, dealing with things like the fact that the distinction exists, and we need to figure out how this works in relation to the science. This would include, I say moral distinction here, I don't really mean moral in the same way that Professor Dan Drummond means. I mean moral in the fact of before God as a sinful beings, as sinful humanity. And that this includes for humans both the capacity and the responsibility. And the capacity meaning God has given commands to us to obey, and that we are therefore responsible to God. And so I think that this is something that the Bible teaches that is distinct, that before God, like sin in the Bible is before God. We see this in Genesis 9. Humans, that the sin of murder is before God first, not first against the other person who was murdered. And that this is something that is limited to humanity, the capacity, which means you are given a command, and that the responsibility to follow it. But that the consequences of human sin do affect all of creation. And then, of course, this is tied to Christ's incarnation and work. Okay, I'm done. I know that was a little fast. Yeah. Oh, so in conclusion, distinction is not the point. This is my last point. Humanity is not that humanity is distinct and therefore is in a position before God. It's not first that humans are distinguished from the animals, or that humans are distinguished for the sake of humanity. The point is that humans are created in a position before God, and the result of that is the distinction. Okay, now I'm done.
Thank you, Paul. You've given us a fascinating glimpse of what, to all of us, I think, will appear as a major project, which is intrinsically difficult to condense into 25 minutes.
I know, I should.
But some extremely interesting issues there. Have we time for a quick?
I want to give Professor Van der Brink plenty of time for his talk. So.
Did I see a whisper? Yes. Well, perhaps we could take it.
So, I mean, okay. So, I know you said at the very beginning that ethics is you're avoiding the ethics conversation, but I'm going to bring it.
Okay, sure. I'm not avoiding. I'm just saying I don't have time.
Okay, fair. So I have, and this is obviously my personal opinion, but I have reservations whenever anyone in any context says, "Oh, I don't have. Let's remove the ethics side
Yes.
of this."
Yes.
Because it kind of takes away a lot of important conversation.
Yes.
And it allows. So in science, a lot of the time we say, "Oh, I don't have time to talk about the ethics because I just want to talk about the facts."
Yeah.
And this is. And you kind of did that, right? You said these are the facts, this is that. But I think removing the ethics removes also important topics that come along with this.
Yes.
Like the animal suffering and the human suffering and how they intertwine. And I mean, it's kind of what's already been discussed in other topics as well.
Yeah.
So what is your justification for not talking about ethics other than you don't have time?
Sure. So the one thing I would say, the reason I ordered it the way that I did is that I find in many writers that they kind of start with an ethic and then go back to look for a theology to support this. And so I was saying, look, I think that we can start with a theology that I would argue is faithful to what the Bible teaches and still have a good animal ethic. And so my point was, I guess I was pushing back a little bit that we need to start with the ethic and then find the theology. And that, because I think that has consequences in other areas, like I said, in Christ's redemptive work and atonement and things like this. And so I think it's possible to have a good Christian theology first and then also come to good ethical conclusions. I think that because we are vice-regent kings and queens who are to rule in the place of the deity, right? We're to rule in the place of God. That this gives us a responsibility that we have over creation that we are to do, like in the previous, for animal flourishing. We are to have creation flourish in the way that God would have creation flourish. I think this comes from the theology that of we are made in the image of God. I just didn't have time to work out the implications, I guess. I think that we can start with a theology and still come to the, and still have a good animal ethic from the theology. But I wanted to start, I guess my point was I wanted to start from a good foundation, we'll say. But I think the ethics is important, yes.
Well, thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, thank you.